Welcome to NeuroSociety Stories, a series created by the Dana Foundation that explores the incredible ways that neuroscience is shaping society. Through engaging conversations, we invite Dana Foundation grantees, partners, and other neuroscience and society thought leaders to share stories of discovery, innovation, and impact. Each episode offers unique perspectives on how brain science intersects with fields such as ethics, law, social sciences, and more, advancing neuroscience for the good of all. I'm Caroline Montojo, President and CEO of the Dana Foundation. Join us as we uncover how neuroscience can drive change, inspire new possibilities, and create a future that reflects the aspirations of all people. Hi, Karen. Welcome to the Dana Foundation.
Thanks
I'm so
for
excited to
having
have
me.
you here today.
Thank you.
Yes. Why don't we go ahead and have a seat?
Okay.
All right. From apps that track our mood to AI-powered neurotechnologies that restore communication and movement, brain technologies are rapidly moving from the lab into our daily lives. Neuroethics helps us to make sense of these advances, not only asking what they can do, but what they should do, and how these technologies can affect everything from our privacy to our autonomy to the systems that we all depend on. I am joined today by Karen Rommelfanger, a pioneer at the intersection of neuroscience, ethics, and culture. She is the founder of the Institute of Neuroethics, a think and do tank that is based in Atlanta, Georgia. Karen, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
I am so delighted to have you here today and to hear your story about how you came into the field of neuroethics. So I think we can start with your training and your background. So you trained as a PhD in neuroscience, studying movement disorders. What was the moment or moments that made you realize that neuroscience alone couldn't answer your deeper questions about the mind and behavior?
My journey into neuroscience was really spurred by this desire to understand the mind. And I had read two books, actually, as an undergraduate student that really moved me. And one was The Astonishing Hypothesis by Francis Crick, where essentially he said, we are nothing but our brains. And then the other book was Molecules of Emotion by Candace Pert, where she outlined how all of the emotions we feel are due to some molecular interaction in the brain. And I thought, well, I want to understand how the universe of our mind works. I'll go into neuroscience. But as I got more and more into neuroscience and the granularity, and even studying the smallest unit of the brain, the single cell, the single neuron, I started to have my doubts that I was really understanding the meaning of the mind. And there was a moment where I was recording in deep structures of the brain. And one of the things that is unique about being able to do that is every brain is a little bit different. So what you do is you take a map of the brain and you put an electrode in the brain, and then you detect electrical signatures. And those electrical signatures are transformed into sound. So you kind of can hear where you are in the brain. So I was listening to these cells after I arrived at the point in the brain I was trying to look at, and I was watching the action that was coming from the brain, in theory. There was eye movement, there were head turns, there was even hints that there was some thinking going on. And as I was listening to that neuron sputter and fire, I thought, oh my God, this is not where the mind is. It seemed like there was much, much more that I was missing in the human experience, in living, that the brain was just a part of that. And I needed to think more expansively into really getting to that question.
So interesting to hear your story. I could almost hear the little sputtering of the neurons firing. I mean, wait, that's not quite the mind, is it?
Yeah, you're listening to what used to be kind of TV static type of sound. And it's like, is this what it is? Is this what it boils down to?
Yeah, that's great. So, Karen, we are in a time period where neuroethics is being more deeply integrated into brain initiatives around the world. Just a few years ago, you led the Global Neuroethics Summit in collaboration with Songjin Zhang at the Korea Brain Research Institute. I was so happy to be a part of that a few years ago. It was when I was first starting to learn about what neuroethics is and why it matters. So that was a very special moment in my life too. What I'd love to hear from you as you look back is, what did the Global Neuroethics Summit accomplish, and what do you think its impacts have been in the world?
I think what we're really seeing is that neuroethics actually was a mediator for science and collaboration in this case. And it might be counterintuitive to some who have this view of ethics in general being very compliance oriented. Typically, we have this compliance-based ethics training. It's a requirement of federal funding, and it's good that people are learning about ethics. But that kind of click-based, non-dialogical type of training often betrays this idea of ethics is only compliance. And for that reason, people do not see the creative aspects, how it contributes to innovation, how it works for scientists to enhance their problem solving and the way they explore scientific questions. So when all the BRAIN initiatives started to come online, and it was a very exciting moment, what was really exciting is that the leaders of those BRAIN projects came together and said, we want to make sure that we leverage this great energy. We want to leverage these resources. Rising tides can lift all boats. But then they also realized, if we just come together, that might not be enough. There seems to be more that we need to work out here. I think initially they were thinking, how do we manage collaboration and the sharing of the benefits and credit and things like that? And that's when, our team started coming in and saying, bringing people together in the room together to think about collaborating about science is one thing, but there's something more fundamental about that. Why are you doing this research? Some of the big BRAIN projects had questions like, we want to understand what the human mind is. We want to understand the speed of thought. Big kind of humanistic questions. And these are values that demonstrate the social embeddedness of science. And so we needed to think about what was the wraparound culture that was driving these scientific projects, the way that they were conducted, and the outputs from them. So we advocated, me, Sunjing Zhong, and we had help from people like you and others who came together to understand the vision that we needed to understand the cultural values behind these projects, articulate them, surface them, create safe spaces for that, and discuss how that might impact the types of ethical questions that we ask. And critiques of even organizations like the UN have leveled that, these are largely Western ideas of ethics and bioethics. Largely Western bioethics, where the individual is the core of our ethics calculus, is something that drives a lot of international policy. So these projects came together and said, we want to look at cross-cultural neuroethics perspectives. And we came together with leaders from the BRAIN projects. We asked the ethicists from the BRAIN projects, even science communicators, engagement specialists, cultural scholars, and said, how might we ask these typical neuroethics questions that we have around protecting mental privacy, promoting agency, what do we consider misuse and best use, and said, how might we put a spin of culture on that? And we created a list of questions, neuroethics questions for neuroscientists in the BRAIN initiatives, 5 of those. And we had several summits, and we put out this article of questions that could be a tool for not just like a checklist, which is actually initially what was asked for, but could be used as a tool for self-efficacy and capacity building. And those set of questions today have continued to find their way into many global policy documents. They also have spurred a lot of exciting energy around cross-cultural neuroethics and thinking about inclusive processes for talking about directions of neuroscience and more. And it's been very exciting to see.
Just reflecting on your last answer, it made me think back to when I was a neuroscience graduate student and had to take the responsible conduct in research course that you described. It was this online module, an hour, 2 hours. And I always remember thinking, there's got to be more than this. I wish I had more training on these ethical and societal dimensions and how they applied to the work that I was doing, even in my postdoc, on biomarkers for psychiatric illness, right? Like, how could that affect stigma? How could that affect communities, patients and their families? So I appreciate you mentioning that. And I think the other thing that came to my mind when you were talking about these large-scale BRAIN initiatives is, at that time, I was facilitating the International BRAIN Initiative. It was all of those leaders of large-scale BRAIN initiatives from around the world getting together. And I remember how surprised in some ways I was that when we asked them, what are the areas that you all most want to collaborate in? They highlighted, we need to be thinking about the ethical and societal implications of neuroscience research and neurotechnology. I would say that was my aha moment. You were talking about your moment. For me, that was really my aha moment, maybe later in life, later in my career, but that really sort of turned my attention. It really shifted my focus to think about what is that, as you call it, a cultural wraparound to how neuroscience is done. So I really appreciate you mentioning that.
What you just mentioned about the sentiments of the leaders of those brain projects, the sentiment that they recognized ethics was going to be important and core to their collaborations, that was really inspiring for me and fortifying for me. And I have to say, as you shared your story about like your mandatory click-based training,
Click-based.
Of course, I also received that. And what was really funny is I was not as open-minded as you when you said, there's got to be more as you were taking this mandatory testing. I actually was thinking, this is silly.
Is it over yet?
Is it over yet? Why am I doing this? I haven't learned anything from this. It reads like a legal document. And in fact, when I started, before I even moved into neuroethics, what I was doing was trying to understand. I was typing in all kinds of words in my search bar to understand. I in fact typed in neuroscience and society, and there was nothing. What would I have done if the Dana Foundation had been there and you'd been leading at that point? Be a totally different world for me. And I know it's a different world for many people today because of that. But at the time, there was nothing. And what popped up, though, was the word neuroethics. And that's another piece of how that training came to me.
Thanks for mentioning that, Karen. It makes me think how far the field has come over a relatively short period of time. You grew up in both Japan and the US, and you've described how that upbringing helped to shape your commitment to including different perspectives in your work. Can you share how you integrate different cultural perspectives into creating a global neuroethics framework?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. Sometimes I'm a little self-conscious about that because it sounds like a little bit of me search. But yes, I grew up in a bicultural family. So my mom is Chinese and from Taiwan, actually, and my dad is from the US. And just kind of inherently in that culture, and I think you can probably relate to some extent, there are a lot of unspoken assumptions about how the world should be. And then you start entering around different cultural groups, different demographics, and you're thinking, oh, this isn't a given. And when I moved to the US, really at the age of 10, during very formative years, I could see just how stark that those differences were. And I think that made me very attuned to thinking about spiritual relationships. My mom is Buddhist. My dad was brought up Catholic. So I was already kind of thinking about those worldviews. Also thinking about language differences. How do you communicate about certain ideas? Responsibility and power dynamics, hierarchy, all of those types of things, even risk-taking. These are all kind of unarticulated, often, dimensions of culture. Not to mention the political histories that one has and elements of that. So as I moved into a topic as grand as something like trying to understand the mind, it became very apparent that there are many different philosophical views on what the mind is, and there are also different views on how the brain contributes to that. And even notions of how do you protect those types of things that emerge from the brain. As I started to move into neuroethics, and I mentioned this a bit earlier, I started seeing how the perspectives were very much oriented around Western bioethics. So for Western bioethics, the bedrock is protecting the individual. But in many cultures, and actually most cultures in the world, there is more leaning towards a continuum of more of a collectivist approach. So that is, I am the product of the relationships around me. And this has real world consequences. So this might impact how one decides to make decision-making around choices in the hospital. This also impacts things like, when do you consider the moment of life? And when do you consider the moment of death? So if one is brain dead, or is one really dead? And I don't mean to suggest that there are these clear binaries either. Most of the countries that I think about and consider are more on a continuum. And even in the US, right, we have pockets of different beliefs. This is why you can be dead in one state and alive in another. This is very interesting. But as you're talking about bringing together the brain projects and what these particular findings mean and how we are to safeguard these things, we need to think about, when I say things like privacy, how does one conceptualize privacy? We often use that term like it mean the same thing, but there are many different types of privacy and dimensions of privacy, like thinking about privacy as property, thinking about privacy as a right to use certain kinds of information. And there are hierarchies into the levels of different kinds of privacy that one might prioritize. This is why you hear things like very lazy statements, like people in China don't care about privacy, for instance. That's not really true. They actually have quite a few very strict privacy laws, but the ways that they conceptualize and enforce might be different. And that type of holistic thinking needed to be pulled into these conversations with scientists, that there was more expertise needed, there were more a breadth of views, and not to impose these ideas, but to foster a curiosity and a safe environment to say, I might have a different view on this. We might think differently about this. And it's also important to know that within that, there are long cultural legacies beyond our existence. In Chinese and in Japanese, the legacy of the word privacy itself means shameful secrets. So to want privacy would suggest that you have something shameful to begin with, to hide. So these are things that, it's not to say that if you went up to a native Chinese speaker that they would say, like, yes, privacy means shameful secrets. But that unspoken assumption does pervade in the history of the way we use and operationalize that term. So these are the types of things that we try to unearth in our conversations.
I think those are such important examples to share. And I really appreciate you giving some of these really concrete ways that what's meant in one context is very differently perceived and understood in a different context.
Yeah.
In your organization, the Institute of Neuroethics, you talk about neuroethics by design. Can you share what that means and how does that relate to real-world neurotechnology development?
So neuroethics by design considers ethics a core design requirement for any neurotechnology. And that really comes from, over the past 5 years in particular, trying to move towards more of an implementation focus for neuroethics. So if I may, maybe I'll share a little bit about how we got to INX. And that is, after about 20 years as an academic bench scientist and professor, it became very clear that a lot of the really fabulous work that was being done around neuroethics, even the questions that we created, weren't meeting their full potential. And so part of that and this is something we even looked at with the global neuroethics work, is what are the challenges with implementation? People don't really understand the value proposition of neuroethics. They don't really understand how it's going to actually impact the end deliverable. Can it truly advance neuroscience? How do you get all these people together? They're really practical nuts and bolts. How do you translate these very complex terms into daily activity? So it was actually during the pandemic that, for me, it kind of came to a head, and I thought, well, how do we design implementation strategies? And this is where I designed 2 different organizations. One is the Institute of Neuroethics. It's a think and do tank, works at systems level change, where we work to create trusted neurotechnology that can empower all. And there we work with people who build technology, people who make decisions about technology, like policymakers and end users, to implement system level solutions. I also launched a boutique consultancy, which is Ninga Neuroethics Collab. And that is a neuroethics by design collab, where I get in the field, I roll up my sleeves and I pilot projects with policy institutes, companies, et cetera, to work on case studies on the ground. Whatever entity I work with through my consultancy, they're actually required to, 1, not share that we're working together, because I don't want to be used for ethics washing or for marketing and ethics. And 2, that whatever we create together can be shared and that other people can use it, because what we're trying to do is build exemplars and exemplary cases and tools that people can use more broadly. So what neuroethics by design does is it integrates ethics reflection with practical, actionable methods and tools. So for example, when one is designing a research question, one might consider what kinds of ethical tensions might arise. You brought up earlier, even doing biomarkers for schizophrenia. How are the questions that we're asking representing or reinforcing stigma about some of these groups? Are we including some of the research questions that even matter to those who most have their lives touched by these diseases and conditions? Here, I'll bring up an engineering example. You can integrate ethical affordances into your prototype. So that could mean things like designing more granular controls for users to collect data or not, letting them know when their brain data is being collected, or even giving them certain amounts of control for when the device is working or not working. And then in the dissemination phase, this is where we can think about what are the implications of these findings in a variety of jurisdictions that they'll be applied in. So this could be working with consumer advocacy groups. This could be working with labor groups who think about how these devices might be used in the workplace. This could be used working with clinicians. So these are ways that you start to be able to anticipate by working with a wide variety of communities how these technologies could be used best and potentially misused. And then you take those learnings, and it's a cycle, and you reiterate. So that's what neuroethics by design at its best should do. And while it initially was conceived for people who design technologies or who researchers, it's best implemented in collaboration with diverse communities. And I don't mean just collaboration like you bring people in, but a meaningful engagement where there's dialogue and exchange.
It's so interesting because it goes all the way from design all the way through to dissemination and how it shows up in the world. And it also sounds like, you were talking about bringing a lot of different perspectives to these conversations. So it actually even starts, almost upstream of design in some ways, because you're taking in their thoughts, their needs, their values into that design. So I really appreciate that. So Karen, we see many dystopian scenarios when we watch movies or see media around neurotechnology and artificial intelligence. Black Mirror comes to mind. Sometimes Minority Report, the movie, comes to mind. I think there's a lot of examples. Can you share what your views of the future of neurotechnology are? And perhaps even more than that, could you share how you think we could shape a flourishing future for society in the context of these technologies?
I think I'll say first that I absolutely believe we can have a flourishing future with neurotechnology. That is not out of reach, and it is very much something that we can have as a reality, a shared reality. But it must be a deliberate choice. What's really fascinating about science fiction is that we think it foretells the future, but really it tells how we are now. It tells us about the values that we hold now, the ways that the world works now, and how these types of future technologies would fit if we kept the values that we have now and the status quo now. So I pose, are neuroscientists today more like Copernicus, understanding the mechanisms of the universe, of our mind? Or are they more like Oppenheimer, unprepared to address the ethical reverberations of their creations? And I think that unlike Oppenheimer, we actually have a lot of tools that we're developing where scientists can be prepared. They can be ahead of the game. They can be proactive and not just reactive and following a common storyline. Scientists today and many communities and the publics can co-create a future together as long as we can set that as a priority and an agenda. So this is part of the reason why I've advocated for neuroethics by design, that is, creating neurotechnologies with ethical affordances built in as an ethical requirement, as a technical requirement, as a core element. We don't only need to include scientists in that conversation. The most difficult problems are actually solved by diverse communities of thinkers. So this is where we need to pull in the collective wisdom of wide arrays of people. The first step is recognizing that we can benefit from this collective brainstorming that can actually move to action. It doesn't have to stay at brainstorming. But also that there are different ways and modes that we have to be willing to interact with one another. We can come together. You can talk to people who have expertise that isn't shared by you. Also understanding that communities with lived experience and publics have their own expertise when it comes to ethics, in that they do have their values that they bring to the table, and they can talk about future ways that they'd like the technologies to be used or created for them. So unlike Oppenheimer, like I mentioned, we do have these strategies and tools, and we can move forward together, and we can set this as an agenda. But the hardest thing is just making that a priority. And it doesn't have a weak value proposition. It's actually quite strong. Who doesn't want a world where we can benefit and flourish from the findings of neuroscience and the developments in neurotechnology?
Thank you for painting a more optimistic future of human flourishing with your calls for thinking proactively about neurotechnology and neuroscience, as well as doing that in co-creation with many perspectives to help shape that future. So I appreciate that. What I'd love to talk about now is what you've described as a blurred zone in neurotechnology development for devices that live between medical and non-medical use, such as wellness data. Can you share a little bit more about your thoughts on that? And are the ethical questions for those types of devices different than they are for medical devices?
There is a increasing consumer appetite for brain technologies. We already know that recent World Health Organization report that 1 in 3 people are going to develop a brain disorder in their lifetime. And we have a lot of work cut out for us. And then there are some disorders that kind of blur the line of wellness and disease. So maybe you wouldn't get a diagnosis, but maybe you are wanting to be more in control of how your mood fluctuates, your alertness. Maybe you're working a lot of hours and you want to have some time to play. You want to be alert when you read, things that we can't do in a hustle culture, I guess. And then there are a set of technologies that are being built for more classically targeted specifically for a disorder, and they're, tear-jerking, amazing feats. So helping people to speak again after losing a voice after stroke. In fact, being able to translate their language into the language of their choice if they're bilingual, and then also into a digital avatar of their choice. And then there are also major developments in intractable depression where people feel that they are made human again from the implantation of a device. Brandy Ellis has said, as a cyborg, I am more able to be part of my community. Whereas other participants say things like, I feel like an electric doll. So these types of learnings show us just how empowering these technologies can be for people who are empowering or even transformative to their social interactions in their lives. And we could also see how if you take those out of the medical domain and the clinical domain, how those could also have impacts in future of work. You could see them for education systems, for national defense. And each of those would bring a different ethical calculus, because what we do in most of those scenarios is we evaluate a risk and a benefit. So when we're in a disease state, where maybe a terminal one, we might be willing to take more risk for certain quality of life improvements, even if they're not curative. But if you're a healthy young person, maybe we don't want to be putting a brain implant in for which we don't know how it's going to impact their life trajectory, their development, their ability for self-determination towards a future that is their own. So we are already in the habit of giving lots of data away for free, for free in exchange for your data, of course. We do this with our phones, with our watches, to receive free internet access, to receive a coupons for shopping. We give away our data all the time. And we already know that those data are used in ways that we don't like, right? They're sold to others. They're used for discrimination. Either they could be discrimination in the workplace. They could be discrimination amongst peers for social groups. But with brain data, it might be even more precious, because with brain data, we are looking at not just who you are now, but we might be able to make predictions about your brain function in the future. And the more sophisticated we get with understanding how to analyze these data, the more insights we might gain on people. And for this reason, there's been a huge debate about who should have appropriate jurisdiction over brain data. Right now, this is a conversation that needs to be happening with people with legal expertise, as well as scientists who can understand the capacity of those technologies. But really missing from those conversations are two critical groups. One are those users of the technology, and two are the people, private sector ecosystem, who are building those technologies. So what we need, in addition to a host of other ethical questions about empowerment, agency, non-discrimination, and others, we need to be having conversations as well about how we think these data could be used, what they even are, what the potential is for their use in the future, and whether they should be monetized or not. And there's a lot of activity in that space, not just in neurotechnology and others, in cryptocurrency markets for this, which is I think, an alarming area for thinking about exchange for brain data. So there's a big conversation that needs to be had with a wide community in various jurisdictions of abuse, and we're a little behind on that.
Well, it's good we're having that conversation and that there are people who are pushing that conversation as well, especially in the industry space where these technologies are moving forward so quickly. Karen, thank you so much for joining us today on NeuroSociety Stories. I so appreciated hearing about your background, how that influenced how you approach your work, and also how you're helping to shape neurotechnology that is truly inclusive and co-created for the benefit of society. So thank you for coming to New York.
Thank you for having me.